Okay, thank you so much for your patience, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of the Office of Community Affairs, Real-Time Communications Lab, and the Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions at Illinois Tech, we welcome you to this, the first installment of our 2022 Tech and Social Justice series. Please allow me to introduce you to Carol Davids, who is the director of the Real-Time Communications Lab. Carol, can you share some information about your lab with our participants?
Sure, thanks. So the lab is both a teaching lab and a lab where we do testing for networked products, basically multimedia real time, like Skype, like Zoom. And so the lab has been around since 2004. And a few years back, we wanted to make sure that that we as developers and implementers of technology were also doing it in the interest of humanity and not necessarily in the interest of some companies or private interests and private profits. So we wanted to make sure that, and the students wanted that very much. Often my students before graduation would say, where could I get an ethical job in technology? Seriously seeing all of the terrible results of the misapplication of technology. So that was when Elisa and I got together, truly conspired to begin this series. So thanks, Elisa. And looking forward to this talk. Yeah.
My pleasure. And there's always a co-conspirator, a third conspirator, and that would be Dr. Elizabeth Hilt, who heads up our center. So could you please tell our audience, Elizabeth, a bit about the center?
The Ethics Center at Illinois Institute of Technology. Yeah, it has a very long name, the Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions. It's actually one of the oldest ethics centers nationwide. It's more than 45 years old. We are interested in ethical and social aspects of science, technology, and engineering, and in research ethics. We do research into ethical and social implications, but we also teach students at Illinois Tech and organize workshops and webinars and speaker series and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All righty. I am Aletha Bunton, and I am the Assistant Vice President of Community Affairs, and I am your moderator for the evening. But before I introduce our esteemed speakers, let's pause just for a moment to review the etiquette and some expectations that we have for the evening. We ask that you please put your comments and questions in the chat for both James and Alex, and we will address as many of them as time will allow. If we have an audience member who requires ASL, what I will do is unpin the speakers who appear on your screen right now, and I will then spotlight the interpreter so that the individuals who need that service will be able to see her exclusively. If that happens, you may want to adjust the settings on your Zoom. You would go to View and select Speaker Only, and that way you would be able to still see whoever is speaking in the moment. This session is being recorded, and a copy of it will be provided to you in the future. So thank you for your cooperation and allowing me to share that information. Our first speaker is James Kilgore. He is an activist and writer who's based in Urbana, Illinois. He is the director of the Challenging Incarceration Project at Media Justice and the director of advocacy and outreach for First Followers Reentry Program in his hometown. He is the author of 6 books, 4 of which he drafted during his 6.5 years in both federal and state prisons in California. His most recent work, which you can see on my bookshelf, I'm pointing to it right now, it's on that middle shelf, is titled Understanding Incarceration, which draws heavily on his experience of spending a year on an electronic monitor after being released from prison. In addition, he's also written extensively on mass incarceration and the political and economic history of Southern Africa, with a particular focus on labor. He currently serves as adjunct faculty in the program of global studies at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. He is the father of 2 sons and proud grandpa of 1 granddaughter, and the life partner of Teresa Barnes, who is also a professor. She's a professor of history at the University of Illinois. Following James, we will hear from Alexandra Franco, a visiting assistant professor of law at our law school, which is Chicago Kent College of Law. Her academic research agenda focuses on the intersection of science, technology, and the law, right? She's the perfect person for this evening. Alex's current scholarly research projects focus on science, technology, law, and how they interact and the policies affect contemporary society, in particular underrepresented and vulnerable populations. She is the author of various academic articles addressing cutting-edge legal issues in diverse areas of science and technology, such as those affecting clinical research trials, as well as the development of performance enhancement and genetic editing technologies. She is the co-author of the 2021 Guide to the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, a book providing a thorough overview and analysis of recent developments relating to the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act. It is the most comprehensive biometric privacy law in the country. Alex obtained her doctorate of jurisprudence from Chicago Kent in 2016 and is an attorney licensed to practice law in the state of Illinois, as well as the Supreme Court of the United States. Alex is going to discuss the factual, legal, and policy background relating to the practices and policies encompassed within the term incarceration. She's also going to get into some of the legal and regulatory landscape applicable to some technologies that are often used for surveillance of those involved in the criminal justice system, and how the loopholes in the legal and regulatory landscape allow for indiscriminate use of these technologies. So that is a bit about our speakers for the evening. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to James. I do believe you have a video snippet that you want to share before we begin talking.
Yes, that's right.
What is the biggest waste of money?
Okay, I got one for this. I was just released from prison. I did 21 years, 2 months, and 11 days total. But I didn't get released like from prison to be free. I had to do a year house arrest after I.
What is the biggest waste of money?
Okay, I got one for this. I was just released from prison. I did 21 years, 2 months, and 11 days total. But I didn't get released like from prison to be free. I had to do a year house arrest after all that time. And they charged me $15 a day when I got released from prison to do house arrest. Now, mind you, I just done 2 decades in prison and didn't even have a job, had nothing in order with my life. And the charges started immediately when I got home. $15 fucking a day to do house arrest.
What is the biggest waste of money?
So thank you, Alicia. Thank you to everyone for coming. Like Comrade Sing Q, as he calls himself on the video, I also spent a year on an electronic monitor after I came out of prison in 2009. In fact, the second day I came home to Illinois, a woman from the Department of Corrections came and put this device on my ankle and told me I had to stay home until my parole agent called me. So the next day, the parole agent phoned and he said I could only be allowed out of the house Monday through Friday from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and that I should be able to handle all my business during that time. So that began a different perspective on freedom for me. And I began to do research on electronic monitoring because I wondered, who came up with this idea? Who made the rules for it? Who is making money off of it? And most importantly, because this was only 2009, still early days for smartphones and so forth, where was this technology heading? These were still the early days of ankle monitors that had GPS tracking capacity. But I could see that this technology around me was moving very quickly, and I could only begin to imagine what it would be like in 2019, 10 years down the road, or today, 2022. So since that time, I've been involved in doing research on electronic monitoring and trying to bring the voices and the experiences of people who've been on a monitor front and center in order to bring the issue onto the policy agenda. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint here that'll help me. The biggest way that'll help guide us through a few points that I want to make here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's me in one of my happier days. That's day 366 of my electronic monitoring regime, the day I took the device off. And this is a bit of an older device, so it came with a big box, but it did have a GPS tracker on it. So these are just some images of electronic monitors, just to give people some ideas of what they look like, how they might affect people's legs, how somebody like Kentavious Caldwell-Pope could manage to play for the Los Angeles Lakers wearing an electronic monitor, or how you might go to the beach with an electronic monitor. This is a picture of Prakash Shuraman, who's been on a monitor for about 17 months now, while he awaits a retrial on a charge that he was convicted of when he was 15 years old. And so he's under 24/7 house arrest. This is Charlie Sanders, a young man from Chicago who was put on an electronic monitor. And when he was asked to draw a picture of his experience of a monitor, he drew himself in this big room, very isolated, with this thing attached to his ankle. So I'm going to just go through the basics of electronic monitoring here. Based on my research, on my experience and the experience of many other people that I've interviewed over the years and written about in various reports and spoken about in various videos and other interviews. So the first question is, who's on electronic monitoring? So there's four main groups of people on electronic monitors. There's people who have been released from jail, pretrial, who haven't finished their case up yet, but they're being released on bail or without bail, and they're being put on electronic monitor while they await the resolution of their case. Secondly, we have people who have finished a prison sentence, like myself, like Comrade Sin-Q, aka Michael Lacey, who you saw in the video, and we get an electronic monitor for as a condition of our parole or supervision. Thirdly, there are youth like Charlie Sanders in the picture here, people who are under 18, sometimes as young as 12 or 13 that are put on these devices for some kind of encounter they might have with the criminal legal system. And then fourthly, we have immigrants who are under the authority of the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE. And we have something like 126,000 people under the authority of ICE on electronic monitors. There's also a couple of other usages. One is on SCRAM monitors, which are used mainly for people that have driving under the influence, and SCRAM monitors measure the alcohol content in your perspiration. So it's a way of trying to restrict your alcohol consumption if you're under supervision. How many people are on electronic monitoring, which we do call EM? We don't know. No one can tell us how many people are on electronic monitoring in the US. Electronic monitoring it's very opaque. The companies do not share how many devices they have in circulation. Most jurisdictions do not collect much data on it. We have no, unlike with prisons and jails or people on parole, we have no national census of how many people are on electronic monitoring. We have some counts that are done at the county or the state level, but nothing composite. We have I think the estimates are it's probably somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people on electronic monitors as we speak. But once again, we don't know. The monitoring companies and the people that set up monitoring in local authorities and for states don't hold anybody accountable for what happens with electronic monitoring. Not only do they not count people, but they don't do any kind of evaluation or assessment of what's happening with these devices. So it's important to recognize that electronic monitoring is contracted at county level primarily. So we probably have somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 counties in the US have electronic monitoring programs. Most of them have an individual contract with a company, a provider, and some of them keep records, some of them don't. I mean, I've done Freedom of Information Act requests for a lot of jurisdictions and gotten very little back by way of data. What's the argument for electronic monitoring? The argument is it's supposed to help keep communities safe. It's supposed to help us keep track of people who might be potentially dangerous, people who might not show up for their court appearances. But what's the evidence for electronic monitoring? I would say almost nothing. There's very little assessment, evaluation of the impact of these devices. The research that's been done on electronic monitoring is extremely poorly designed so that you can't really rely on the evidence that's out there, which is minuscule. In the last year and a half, we've had some fairly important local reports done, one in Cook County and one in Los Angeles. And these devices have told, and this research has told us a couple of things about electronic monitoring. First, that there's no evidence to support that people with an electronic monitor are more likely to show up for a court appearance than people who are not. Secondly, it shows us that Black people in particular are far more likely to be on an electronic monitor than white people or other sectors of the population. But it doesn't really give us much more than that. It doesn't tell us, for example, how many people are sent back to jail or prison because they violate the laws, the rules of electronic monitoring, which I'll come to in a minute. And it doesn't really tell us why somebody's put on an electronic monitor. Some people are required by law to be on an electronic monitor, but the majority are not. They're put on there because somebody makes a decision to put them on there. Who makes money from electronic monitoring? Well, there's dozens and dozens of companies across the country that produce electronic monitors and rent them to local jurisdictions or to state departments of corrections. But there's 4 players in the market that are bigger than everybody else. The biggest is a company called BI, which was one of the originators of electronic monitoring back in the 1980s, and built their electronic monitors from their previous business of tagging livestock. They are the biggest. There's Attenti is another large company. Supercom is another large company. Both of those companies are based in Israel. And then Sentinel is another large company. And a fifth one I should mention is Satellite Tracking of People, which is also known as STOP. Lastly, what are the grievances from electronic monitoring? What are the complaints that people give when they're put on electronic monitor? First of all, I've never interviewed anyone, and I've interviewed dozens of people in many states, many jurisdictions, and I've never found a single person who didn't say that these devices were technically inefficient, that they didn't report them being out of their house when they weren't out of their house, that the battery didn't die, that the device somehow didn't work when it was supposed to, that it burnt their leg, that it maybe gave them an electric shock. But the grievances that are most common from electronic monitoring are 2. Firstly, that you generally have to get permission in advance to leave your house, sometimes for up to 2 weeks. When I was on the monitor, I used to give my parole agent a schedule of my movements for 2 weeks at a time, and I couldn't leave the house if I didn't have permission. So what does this mean? This means that you can't take a walk around the block to get some fresh air. It means that if you get a call to do a job interview, you can't respond. If you're working and you get called in early, called in on your day off, you can't respond to that because you can't get permission from your parole agent, because you don't typically have that person's phone number. You have an 800 number that you phone, then they contact the parole agent. If you have a medical emergency, you have a serious moral dilemma. For myself, during my time of being on an electronic monitor, my mother, who was 95 at the time, who lived about a 10-minute drive from us, called me one morning at 2 o'clock, said she was having chest pains, thought she was having a heart attack, had already called 911. My natural response would have been to go to her or to go to the hospital, but instead I went to the phone. I phoned the 800 number. I asked them if I could go to be where my mother was, and they said, you have to get permission from your parole agent. Well, I know the parole agent is not going to pick up that phone at 2 o'clock in the morning, so I had to make a choice. Do I go to the hospital and risk being sent back to prison? Or do I stay home and risk my mother passing away in the hospital in my absence after I'd already been absent during my time in prison? Fortunately, my partner was able to go at 2 a.m. I went at 6 a.m. when I had movement. And later in the day, I phoned my parole agent and I asked him, in the future, would I be able to respond to a call like that? And he told me, it's a gray area. Anybody that's been in prison knows gray areas are not something that you play around with. So generally, I would just say that that electronic monitoring, there's no evidence that it has a positive impact. I was recently part of a research project, which is soon to be released. We interviewed people in 9 local jurisdictions across the country in 9 different states. We interviewed prosecutors, we interviewed judges, we interviewed pretrial service folks, we interviewed people that had been on the monitor, and we did not find a single person in that population that was an advocate of electronic monitoring, that thought it was really effective. So what I've been doing over the course of the past several years, working with my organization, Media Justice, I've been trying to work on building a counter narrative to the idea that electronic monitoring is an alternative to incarceration. It's not. It's an alternative form of incarceration. It turns your house into a carceral space, and it turns your family members or whoever lives with you into somewhat of a prison guard that has to take care of you, that typically has to provide for your psychological supports, but also your financial needs, because it's very difficult to get employment when you're on an electronic monitor. So we see this as a technological jail, a digital prison. We refer to it as a form of e-carceration, the use of technology to punish and to control people and to deprive them of their liberty in much the same way that jails and prisons do. We aim to counter the "it's better than jail" myth. When I started doing this research, people kept saying, well, it's better than jail. And my response was always, that's not the point. The point is that it's still jail. It's still prison. A minimum security prison is better than a maximum security prison, but it's still prison. It's not doing what it's supposed to do, and it's punishing and coercing the people that use it. So but I want to make a caveat on this, in that I don't say that somebody that's in jail should refuse to come out on an electronic monitor. It's up to them to decide whether they want to come out on that monitor or not. I would never say, well, that's going to be terrible. Well, jail's terrible too, so it's up to them to decide. But what I would say is that I'm not going to try to advocate for electronic monitors as an alternative to incarceration. I'm going to advocate for getting rid of electronic monitoring and using the money that you spend on monitors to provide people with the supports they need to not go back to prison. And that means help with employment, help with mental health issues, help with physical health issues, and so forth, the supports that they need to not repeat their prison experience. But instead, the use of electronic monitoring widens the carceral net. It means our total number of people under incarceration is greater when we combine people in jail, people in prison, and people on house arrest. And we're seeing that in Chicago right now. At the moment, during COVID, they released a lot of people on monitors, reduced the jail population. Now the jail population is back up to what it was before COVID, but the electronic monitoring population is higher. And that's the case in many other places in the country, Houston in particular, which has the biggest electronic monitoring, pretrial electronic monitoring country and program in the country, over 4,000 people. It was 27 people in 2019.
All right, James, I want to jump in for a second though. And I want to thank you for providing this overview for our audience, which consists of students and technologists and professors as well. You know, we used to say that cash is king, but in today's society, data is king. And what I've heard you say and what I've read in the book is that these EM devices are not only tracking and sending your geotagged coordinates to a particular place, but it's also collecting some biometric information about individuals. I've read and I've heard from you that there are flaws, many flaws within the system, faulty alarms or alerts going off stating that the person is, you know, is having movement when in fact they are not. All of this though is troubling because everything is so interconnected nowadays. So the data that goes from the device to the center, it goes to the cloud, it's linked with a database, and in some places of the country, it's been used for predictive policing. And I want you to talk a little bit about digital policing that has occurred as a result of this type of technology. If you can take us to the East Coast, take us to Camden, New Jersey, and talk about ICANN and what you call Silicon Valley policing.
Okay, yeah, I can do that. So, I mean, to follow up on your points. I mean, I just wanted to note that, I mean, electronic monitoring is now part of the surveillance state. Ever since electronic monitoring devices in the early 2000s gained GPS tracking capacity, they became, as Alicia has pointed out, part of a surveillance state that's connected to a lot of databases from many sources that are gathering data on us, not only on our location, but in some cases, gathering data about your heartbeat, your gait, all kinds of, we know we have facial recognition technology that gets launched into the databases. We have license plate readers that grab data, and all these things go into the database. And the databases are really computer clouds, and the major owners of these are Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. So these are huge companies that market this data and can use it, sell it to government for control, and sell it to corporations that are trying to sell goods. So one of the places this comes in, as you've noted, is in policing, where during the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, there was a big cry for abolishing police. And many people looked to Camden, New Jersey as a city that had abolished police. And what they had actually done is they had abolished the police department for the city of Camden, slashed the labor force and destroyed their union contract, and then re-employed them in the county of Camden to do essentially a similar job to what they were doing before. But in their place came a whole host of technologies, that surveilled the community. So I'm going to just read about 3 sentences from the book that describe what happened in Camden. Camden became a live testing ground for every e-carceral toy and piece of equipment. A total of 121 cameras watched virtually every inch of sidewalk. 35 shot spotter microphones, which record the location of gunshots, were put in place. Police cars were fitted with scanners that read the license plate number of every passing vehicle. and Sky Patrol, a mobile 40-foot high information gathering tower, became normalized as part of the community landscape. ICANN and Police on the Beat were complemented by virtual patrols, a scan of the vast network of cameras and other surveillance devices to target police operations where crime was supposedly happening. E-carceration was also personalized, with residents being asked to download the Stop It app, which enabled people to report crimes and gunshots anonymously. So we're really seeing this technology, or these technologies, being offered as an alternative to police, and police become data gatherers. So they're walking the streets. I mean, in Camden, they had an ice cream truck, and they were giving out ice cream cones to people to talk to the officer friendly about what was going on in the neighborhood. But the police were all the while taking notes and gathering this data, and then taking it to the data centers in the city in order for that to be processed and pushed to the cloud and the databases in the sky, so to speak. So I think that's just one of the ways in which that played out. And what it did was that technology served to kind of seal off the privileged area of the city, so they would be able to attract investment. So they attracted major investment. They built a new sports arena. They attracted national headquarters of companies and so forth that were never going to come to Camden before, because 5 years before, Camden was labeled as the poorest and most violent city in the country.
Indeed. I am from the East Coast, and I know for a fact what Camden, New Jersey was like, and how most folks would not want to go to Camden, because it was a very depressed area with few jobs and economic opportunities for folks. But I want to just sort of mention that our Illinois version of the citizens database that you just mentioned, I actually have on my phone, and it's called Citizen. And with the Citizen app, you can do many of the things that you just described. You can report a crime, you can report the description of the individual that you may have witnessed committing the crime. And of course, all of that data is going up into the cloud. I want to read a quote that you have in the book. Well, actually, yes, I'm going to read this quote, and that's going to be the jumping off point for Alex to enter the conversation. So Virginia Eubanks is the person to whom I can give attribution to the following words. Think of the digital poorhouse as an invisible spider web woven of fiber optic strands. Each strand functions as a microphone, a camera, a fingerprint scanner, a GPS tracker, an alarm tripwire, and a crystal ball. They are interconnected, creating a network that moves petabytes of data. So Alex, if you don't mind, you are the queen of data and privacy and infractions thereof and nefarious uses thereof. So react to that and then share some more information with us.
All right, so I think I'll react to that from my legal and policy perspective, agreeing with you that, this is something that is all encompassing and that is not limited at all to the issue of electronic monitoring or electronic monitoring generally. But that it is a reflection, that issue of electronic monitoring that James spoke about earlier is kind of a symptom of a system, as he himself explained, that is very much based on a culture of surveillance. And that the culture of surveillance is something that has invariably and always been more significantly bore a significantly negative effect for communities of color, underrepresented communities, and communities that have suffered from massive incarceration, such as the African American and Latino communities. So it's something that has begun to morph away from the exclusive realm of the criminal justice system into the everyday life of everybody. And still, just as it has done since the very first time that the electronic ankle monitoring was used in the 80s, I believe it was in Florida, the Florida Police Department, now into an all-encompassing system or machine that is serving to further disenfranchise and further oppress communities that have been oppressed and discriminated against historically. So with that, I am going to share my screen. I'm not a fan of PowerPoints, but I do feel like people like them more now since we've been stuck with Zoom for quite a while. So I will go ahead and do that. You please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, Alex, we can see it.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about generally of the illegal issues in surveillance and underrepresented communities, which very much affect communities that have been involved, people that in communities that have been historically involved with the criminal justice system due to over-policing, over-incarceration, and generally discriminatory practices by the legal system. So what I've noticed is a transformation and inherent, if not recognized, transformation of the term electronic monitoring. So electronic monitoring, my understanding is that one of the first historical uses of in the traditional sense that James spoke about was in 1984. That has been done for a very long time, and it has served to oppress people who have already been, in prison or in jail or whatever, and who are trying to get on with their lives and are unable to, because it limits their opportunities. It limits their opportunities for healthcare, as he mentioned, people who can't go to the doctor because they have an emergency. They have limited their opportunities for employment. You can't go to a job interview. You can't do any of that stuff freely. So the problem is that what I see as a transformation of the term electronic monitoring is something that needs to be recognized, because GPS smartphone tracking did not become available until 2005. And it is very much one of the many things in which people are being constantly placed under surveillance, and those in communities that have been discriminated against historically have and will continue to suffer disproportionately from the advances in these technologies that have exploded out of control basically since the early 2000s. The national culture of surveillance. Have you ever written the name of an illness or disease on an email that you have sent through Gmail? Google knows. Have you ever searched any private information about yourself, about an illness, about a concern that you had? Google knows. Is your GPS smartphone on? Apple and Android know where you are, or where you've been, or the places that you frequent. Have you bought something from the internet after you clicked on a Facebook app? I know I have. Facebook knows what I like to buy now because I've done it in the past. Do you have an online presence? And what I mean by that is, do you have some sort of profile somewhere, information about you from your job, even from your own, page at work where they have the profiles of employees, or maybe a profile on Facebook or Tinder that you may have made private at some later time after you created it? Then you may want to check out Spokeo.com because they probably have a profile about you. Do you have issues obtaining life insurance, a loan, employment, which are some of the things that people who have been incarcerated generally do struggle a lot with? Then that is going to be even worse now because of all of these technologies and others, which only further help those who are in charge of, issuing life insurances or issuing a loan or, hiring you to discriminate against you, even just because you may have something that connects you to some negative piece of information somewhere that all has been gathered from some source in the internet, enabling them to deny you life insurance, loan, employment, etc. So I noted this down quickly because James talked about these questions at the beginning of when he started talking. Who made the rules for it? Nobody. There are a few exceptions. So Texas, Washington, California, New York, Arkansas, and Illinois have it, and it's just an example in the realm of biometric information. They do have certain statutes that provide some limited protection. But then, as I will cover in the rest of my explanation, the rest of my lecture, I will explain why these are not sufficient. Who's making money from it? James explained it very well. It's private companies. They are the ones who are developing these technologies and getting the money from reaping the benefits that whatever benefits they may give those who employ them. Where is that technology heading? It's just heading for further surveillance, enabling further surveillance of people who have had contact with the criminal justice system and people who have never had contact with the criminal justice system, in particular minorities and underrepresented communities. So it's just allowing the increasing out of control of the surveillance state spearheaded by the private sector, not even the government. The government doesn't have the capabilities or the ability to develop these technologies, so they have to depend on private companies to do it for them. And I wanted to talk a little bit, to go back a little bit and talk about the history of predictive policing, basically, and how technology can be misused or adapted in ways in which it might not be in the best interest of the communities it's supposed to be serving. So predictive policing started with what's called hotspot mapping. It was actually two botanists known as Philip Clark and Francis Evans, the ones who started developing an algorithm, a formula, to try to understand how seemingly random clustering of plants and animals could actually reveal patterns and help them understand the distribution of that particular population of plants and animals. So they would go from your regular distribution of, of random, organized, and then they would develop, they try to develop this formula to understand how that random and seemingly would develop into an organized sort of clustering pattern. The way in which they did it was measuring the space between plants and animals into what they called, random distribution. And the way that defined random distribution was a set of points in a given area that have the same chance of occurring in any sub-area at any other point. This allowed the two scientists to see any deviation from the mean number of the distribution of a particular plant of animal species to detect the clustering that we see in this final little, one of the third of the three squares that I have there. So this was actually pretty useful in the botany example, and then it became adapted for law enforcement purposes. So one of the first uses was by a system known as CrimeStat. CrimeStat basically became a way to forecast the occurrence of crime by collecting data points of historical trends in particular areas of a city relating to how many arrests there had been in that city, or how many instances of crime had there been reported, or arrests in a particular area of the city. So in botany, it was useful to have that hotspot mechanism to identify, for example, the spread of a native or invasive species based on contemporary or forward-looking data. So the active spread of a species as the scientists monitor it. But in the context of policing, identification of an area meant to using backwards-looking data based on historical data of, using historical data of how often crime occurred in an area, how often people were arrested in a particular area. And that data itself was collected pursuant to inherently discriminatory, most of the time inherently discriminatory or biased policing techniques. So it became kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. If you're over policing a neighborhood that is a majority minority neighborhood, African American, Hispanic, etc., then you're of course going to be collecting more data about crime occurring in that area, and you're going to assume, or they've assumed for the longest time, that that area is more prone to crime just because it has been over monitored and over policed, not because there's necessarily any empirical data to suggest that that area is more prone to crime. Is just because it has been over policed. And if you have police in an area all the time checking out for crime, making their own reports about what they perceive as crime or suspicious activity, and arresting people for whatever the reason they're arresting them, then of course you're going to have more data about that area being a quote unquote hotspot for crime. But that doesn't have any kind of necessary extrapolation into the future as to whether that area is more likely to experience crime or not. It's based on, as they say, trash in, trash out. It's based on flawed data, and it spits out bad results that are not helpful for the community, that actually hurt the community, and that perpetuate discriminatory policing and surveillance practices. But this is just the one example. Predictive policing is just the one traditional example of how technology has been used to perpetuate the surveillance state in a way that affects minorities disproportionately. Biometric data collection is one of the latest examples of this. Biometric data was originally developed by scientists, just very much, the hotspot example, by botanists. And it usually was done in forensics to try to identify a person by their facial characteristics. And it was employed very early on by the criminal justice system to just identify people. And the reason for the adoption by the criminal justice system was the reliability of biometric information for identification purposes. For example, your fingerprint is kind of immutable and unchangeable. You can't really change your fingerprints. So you could say that your name is X, Y, and Z, but if the fingerprint data says that you're A, B, and C, then we have a problem. The fingerprint is not really going to be lying. So that is why law enforcement relies and has relied historically on fingerprinting for identification purposes. But that's not all of what the biometric technologies allow for these days. Now we have iris scans, as I had in the previous slide, some of the pictures of iris scans, retina scans, facial geometry measurements. We have fingerprints, even DNA is a form of biometric information. And as I said, the reason why they're important is because they're both unique and immutable. There are no two people with your same retina. There are no two people in the world with your same iris. There are no two people in the world with your same facial geometry or your same fingerprints, and they cannot really be changed. I'm assuming that there might be a way to get extreme surgery to get your facial geometry changed, but that is kind of an extreme example. That's not even possible. You can't change your iris or your retinas or your fingerprints even. You could probably get rid of them. I think there are some historical examples of people who have burned off their fingerprints, but you can't really change them. And so the problem with the increase in biometric enabled technologies is that once they are compromised or misused, whether it be by a private entity or by a private entity that is serving a government agency or a law enforcement agency, they are compromised and you cannot change them. If someone steals your social security number, it's a painful process, but you can get that changed. You can never change your face or your fingerprint, really, ever. I gave a little bit of an overview in the beginning of there being some states that have laws in place to curb the misuse and the unauthorized use of biometric information. So in Illinois, we have BIPA, the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, and this is the most famous part of the act, even though it's way longer than this. No private entity may collect, capture, purchase, receive through trade, or otherwise obtain a person's or customer's biometric identifier or biometric information unless it first informs a person that the biometric marker is being collected, for what reason it is being collected, and for how long, and obtains a written consent from that person. That is key. No one in Illinois can really collect any of your biometric information without first obtaining your informed consent in one way or another. The act also, it's a key part of the act that it bans entities from disclosing that information and from selling it or otherwise receiving any kind of profit from it at all, period. So it is the most comprehensive and the strictest biometric law in the country. Unfortunately,
Alex, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
So how does that work for individuals in Illinois who have the type of EM that also serves as a breathalyzer? In James's book, he mentioned that, as a condition of going home on EM, you have to sign your consent. So given the fact that we have some devices that collect biometric information, how does that work with this act that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I am going to address your point I'll answer the question now. I was going to answer it later, but there's the big problem that even BIPA, which is the strictest law in the country, has, and all of the other laws that exist in the different states and the few states that have them, have the same problem. At least I see it as a problem. Some others do not, which is something very much like this provision, which is from BIPA. Nothing in this act shall be construed to apply to a contractor, subcontractor, or agent of a state agency or unit of local unit of government when working for that state agency or local unit of government. So even BIPA does not apply to law enforcement or to private entities or contractors working for law enforcement. So there it is. Even the strictest law in the country does nothing to prevent the abuse or misuse of a person who has been involved with, in the criminal justice system, and who has their biometric information taken by law enforcement. There's nothing, or their contractors, nothing prevents that from happening. So this is just further underscores what I was talking about, that it just serves, all of the expansion in this technology only serves to further disenfranchise communities of color and underrepresented communities. And the problem is that we also are allowing this to happen, whether we want it or not, by being permissive and by becoming desensitized to private entities' indiscriminate collection nowadays of biometric information, basically for anything. So this is the great boon, as I call it. So it started, the history is long, and the reason why Illinois enacted BIPA in 2008, way before really biometric technologies took off, is because of something that happened in the state. A private company wanted to use Illinois as basically a test state, Illinois and Texas, I believe, at the time, for one of the first attempts at using biometric enabled technologies to conduct financial transactions. So basically you would have your fingerprint scanned at Jeweloscope. That was the place where it was being done. And do you remember that, Alicia?
Yes, I do. And
Yep.
I remember saying I would never do that.
Exactly, and you were a smart person. Yeah, so they wanted to scan your fingerprint at Jewel and link it to your credit, debit card, and other financial information, so you could just go do your shopping and scan your fingerprint there and just get it done and out of the way. Because that is, apparently a lot more convenient than just taking out your debit card. In any event, a lot of people signed up for the trial, and then suddenly the company went bankrupt. And they went bankrupt when they already had people's fingerprints and financial information. And so people will be wondering, what now? what happens to my fingerprints and financial data? The state just basically threw its hands up and said, we don't know. And that is why BIPA came to pass. Long after 2008, these technologies really took off. So in 2011, it was Facebook's tax suggestions. I don't know if anybody remembers, whoever has Facebook, that they were like, who is this, dear friend? Is this you? Then Six Flags came with their season pass fingerprint scanning system, again, linking your season pass to your fingerprints so you can give it to a friend that they enter the park. LA 10 fingerprint scanners. You can use any of our tanning centers around the country if you just use your fingerprint. You don't need to carry your card or anything with you. But what about restaurants? From Let Us Entertain You, if you've ever been to one of those restaurants, they have face scan menus. Scan your face and then we will quick order whatever you prefer from the menu. One of the latest ones was United Airlines installing eye scanners so you could enter their lounges and get your passes quickly for, I believe it was $190 something. Yeah. So it became ubiquitous for absolutely everything and anything. Now, most of us actually are unlocking our phones with our fingerprint. That was unheard of in 2008. You're smart also, Alicia. So back in 2008, that was unheard of. Why was Illinois so proactive about something that wasn't even really on the map? It was because of that problem with that company that was developing the dual OSCO system. But then these other companies went with the general United States system, which is we don't have laws in place preventing the collection of people's biometric information without consent or the misuse or sharing. It was just Illinois is the most strict, and then we have Texas and Washington State, and then basically that's it. And Illinois is still the strictest of all of them. But this opened the Pandora box, and it brings it full circle. I don't know if people have heard in the news of this company known as Clearview AI, which basically makes its living from collecting people's faces from the internet and creating profiles of those people and their identities and selling that information to whoever will buy. It has been promoted to law enforcement as instantly able to identify demonstrators at a protest and identifying people even if they're wearing a face mask. Google actually said that they never engaged in that type of practice of just collecting people's information and faces from the internet to make a profile of them, because they deem that too unethical and too much of a Pandora box. If Google tells you that they are not doing something because they deem it too problematic, then it really is extremely problematic. We're talking about this one company that makes basically its living also of scraping your data for its own benefit. They didn't want to do it. Clearview did it. The problems. Biometric technology is extremely notoriously bad at identifying people of color. People of color have been convicted, wrongly arrested, and basically just targeted for surveillance because the technology has misidentified them. And also the legal is that the few privacy laws in the country, including BIPA, contain the exception that I just showed you, that whatever privacy limitations there are on the collection of people's biometric data don't apply to basically law enforcement or agents of the state or contractors or subcontractors that are working for the state. This brings me to the lawsuit that's been going around in the courts back and forth between the federal and state courts, ACLU versus Clearview AI. ACLU was suing on behalf of organizations serving victims of sexual violence, which are often from underrepresented communities that actually have a hard time speaking up because they feel like they are not going to be believed or that they're going to be blamed for whatever happens. So that is a history of just blaming the victim in underrepresented communities when they've gone to the police to report sexual crime or whatever. So these are organizations that were serving those communities primarily, and ACLU was suing on behalf of them to say, the people that are coming to us are not going to be coming to us anymore if they know that their faces are being scanned and their identity is being collected. So please stop doing that. We are suing under BIPA. BIPA provides a private cause of action that allows people to file a lawsuit if a business is violating that provision of the act. And what Clearview has been repeating ad nauseum in the few states where there are laws and things like that is that it doesn't apply to them because they are working as a contractor or subcontractor of a state agency or local unit of government, such as, the Illinois State Police. So after the lawsuit and after knowing how comprehensive BIPA is in Illinois, Clearview pulled out of Illinois, but that doesn't mean that it is not providing the information of Illinoisans in other states. Nobody knows what it's doing, really. And that would still be a violation of the act if it's providing the information about people from Illinois to other private entities. Which sends me back to a throwback that has been it has been kind of like my curse that has followed me for years and years and got me down the rabbit hole of privacy law, which is Spokio versus Robbins. We've been talking about how the surveillance technologies tend to affect people from minority backgrounds, from minority neighborhoods, and those who are underrepresented, of course, also including those who have been involved with the criminal justice system. So I spoke about Spokio early on in this presentation. I told you to take a look and see if they have a profile about you, because Spokio provides a background check online by scraping information that it finds about you that is openly available, and then kind of figuring out if you have any relatives, who they may be, by connecting you to other people who they think might be related to you, then making a profile about you that might include what they think is your profession, your marital status, your income, your education level, and other things about you that someone who, for example, a prospective employer may want to use to decide whether they want to hire you or not. In this lawsuit, Mr. Robbins, and I'm sorry, this is a misspelling, Mr. Robbins actually sued Spokio because it was violating the federal law in relation to accuracy in reporting background data and background checks to potential employers. It said that Spokio said that it was not really a tangible sort of harm to just have an inaccurate profile about you online, that there's no reason for you to sue based on that. And what Robin said is like, look, I've been looking for employment for a number of months, and here's this profile online of me that gives an inaccurate education level, an inaccurate range of salary that I've had in the past, and an inaccurate marital status. So this is making me unmarketable to potential employers who might be gathering this profile. What did the Supreme Court say in this case? This is from the hand of Justice Alito. It is difficult to imagine how the dissemination of an incorrect zip code without more could work any concrete harm. So basically they said, or Justice Alito, who wrote the opinion, said, we really don't see how the misreporting of some of this information, for example, a zip code, could work any concrete harm on anybody. How could that kind of information be actually harmful in itself? You would have to prove, Mr. Robbins, that you actually faced an adverse employment decision to be able to say that you suffered some real harm. Just having incorrect information about you online is not enough. And my question to the Supreme Court justices and Justice Alito, who wrote this opinion, is I am flabbergasted that the Supreme Court may not be familiar with redlining and how redlining has affected people of color for a very long time. And if you guys are just new to it, I'll give you a refresher. So especially in Chicago, this was a particularly nasty practice where if a family of color wanted to obtain housing in an area that was predominantly white, basically by their zip code in the application to their loan that for getting their home, they would be rejected just because they were in a zip code that was understood as a majority minority zip code from where they lived. And so, yes, I answered to Justice Alito is like, actually I said, no, you're wrong. It is not difficult to imagine how the dissemination of even a correct zip code could work concrete harm on especially a person of color, member of a minority group, and in the context that we're talking about right now, someone who may have had contact with the criminal justice system and who might not even be in monitoring anymore, may just be trying to just,
Right.
go back to their, to their life and try to make a life again. Imagine the information that might be out there about them, and that alone, which is basically by default, preclude them from a loan, from life insurance, from unemployment,
So I'm
gainful employment.
gonna ask you to hold off for just 1 second. Pablo, I've been asking you to unmute yourself so that you can ask your question. If you're having difficulty unmuting, please type your question in the chat.
No, I was just waiting for the professor.
Okay.
Okay, so
Go
I
ahead.
discussed,
Oh,
sorry. So I discussed a little bit in the chat about certain police jurisdictions or police departments using forensic data algorithms to basically match certain individuals' facial characteristics or retinal data with potential suspects of crimes. And in many instances, those algorithms have been wrong, and they have associated certain people with committing certain crimes wrongfully. And when the companies that develop these algorithms have been subpoenaed into courts, they've refused to actually explain how their algorithms work due to patent concerns. And so a lot of law enforcement agencies are essentially using programs to match people with suspects of certain crimes without actually knowing how they work. So is there anything that's being done about that in particular that can be done? Because I see that that can be a pretty big problem, especially as, like, I forgot who was speaking about it, but in Camden, as more cities become, I guess, surveilled at a higher rate, whether or not we like it. I mean, especially as more people start buying iPhones that you can use your face to scan into. What is anyone doing to solve that problem, I guess?
That is a very good question. Unfortunately, I had something prepared for that, so let me share my screen again. So I think that what Pablo was talking about is not just the regular predictive policing based on hotspots and other mechanisms, but a very specific type of predictive policing that actually gained notoriety here in Chicago, in Illinois, and in Chicago as the people-focused predictive policing, which meant that someone not in area of the city, but an actual person would be targeted as likely to be involved in violent crime. How involved? It wasn't specific. You could have been the victim of violent crime, for all you know, based on the algorithm. But of course, if some algorithm that the police is using is saying that you're likely to be involved in violent crime, it doesn't carry a good connotation. It's not going to be heard as necessarily, oh, you might be the victim of it, especially if you're going into minority communities to say that X number of people in here are likely to be involved in violent crime. What is going to happen is that the wrong assumption is that those people are going to be committing violent crime. So actually, Professor Lori Andrews, emeritus, she just retired, worked with the person from main campus who developed this algorithm, Professor Miles Wernick, for a conscious employment of this type of policing, not to just target people in a way that is irresponsible, but to actually help people and prevent them from being involved in violent crime, whether it be as victims or as perpetrators, to actually help these communities, to provide an ethical impact to the people who the algorithm was likely to identify. So this was deployed with the Elgin Police Department also to educate them so that, as you mentioned, Pablo, they understand how these things work, what their limitations are, and so that they don't basically falsely equate an algorithm with a magic ball that is going to tell them everything that they need to know about everyone in every single area of the city, but rather as a tool that needs to be interpreted and employed responsibly. I don't know if this is being done more broadly. I just know of the specific example of a professor who I deeply admire and respect, who was my former professor, Lori Andrews, and my mentor, who actually actively have been trying to direct efforts at educating local governments and police departments, how these things work, what their limitations are, and what the policy perspective should be for implementation, which is rather than just targeting people, just actually reaching out to them to help them not become a part of that predictive effort by the algorithm. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
James, I want you to tell our audience what they should do. What is the call to action? How can they assist?
Well, I think in a lot of communities, there's a lot of effort to end money bail, for example. And law enforcement is often offering electronic monitoring as a solution to that, as an alternative to that. So I think one of the things people can do is work to block that as an alternative and to educate people that this is not supporting people, it's not helping people. And I think what we really need to look at is we need to really reframe our mindset about technology. The narrative of technology as control, as surveillance is dominant. And we have to resist that narrative. We have to think about how technology can be used in different ways that are going to benefit communities, particularly Black and brown communities that are the targets of this technology, that are the most harmed by this technology. So I think we really need to look at our mindset here, because as long as we keep accepting the fact, for example, that we're going to have cell phones that track us, that send all our data to the cloud, and that's just how it is, as long as we keep doing that, we're going to help support the expansion of the powers of Amazon and the companies that are controlling this and are basically really running the planet into the ground.
Thank you. Alex, what can we do? What should we do? And you're still on mute.
Sorry, to echo what James was just saying, I think that it's a matter of understanding that in a vacuum, as the astronomer and professor Carl Sagan, who is also one of my heroes, said, that technology is morally ambiguous and readily employed for evil and for good. It doesn't have moral or ethics attached to it. Technology in a vacuum is not evil and not good. It's the people who develop the technologies and those who employ them, the ones who may readily employ them for whatever purposes they want. And that includes us. That includes us becoming desensitized to readily giving up our privacy, whether it be by giving up our fingerprints to lock our phones, or by telling Facebook, here, yeah, this is a picture of me here. Please go ahead and just tag me on every other picture where I show up. The more that we enable the use of technology for unethical purposes, the more we perpetrate this idea of the surveillance world and the surveillance state, and this fatalistic, we're all doomed and this is the end. We need to become aware and educated about this stuff so that we can just go ahead and stop enabling further, telling companies and the private actors that develop this stuff that we're not going to play into it anymore. And also holding our local governments and law enforcement accountable. I know, as Pablo mentioned, FOIA hasn't gotten very far, and also James mentioned FOIA doesn't really get people very far, but investigative journalists do come up with reports about what's going on. And the more we keep track of the reports of what's going on and what might be affecting our communities, that more that we can take action to prevent these technologies from further targeting unfairly minorities, people of color, and underrepresented people.
Maybe just to follow up on that briefly, I think this should become a political issue. This should be on the agenda of elected officials. We should be querying them. What are you doing about surveillance? What are you doing about technology? What are you doing about Amazon? What are you doing about these companies that are unleashing this technology on communities that have already been victimized by mass incarceration. What are you doing to stop this? Don't offer this surveillance technology as a solution.
Right, and that is the reason why I've always mentioned in my presentation, I just mentioned local governments and states. That's because the federal government is not doing anything, and it's a, you know, it hasn't worked for the longest time if it can't pass generally, you know, COVID relief in a quick sort of manner. What do we do? What can we expect in terms of, you know, biometric information or surveillance generally? So yes, it is a matter of becoming aware and holding our legislatures, whether it be local or national, accountable for something that is of such importance.
All right, I'm going to read something that was put into the chat because those who will later watch this recording won't have the benefit of knowing what was entered in chat. So it says, House Bill 5058, a new bill introduced in Illinois, would create a new felony charge for knowingly removing, tampering with, or interfering with the signal of an electronic monitor. House Bill 5058 is ripe for misapplication due to technological deficiencies of electronic monitoring devices. It is also needlessly enhances penalties for issues addressed in existing law and would increase unnecessary and unjust incarceration. Info on the bill and how to file a witness slip against this bill for this Thursday's hearing can be found here. And there's a hyperlink to endmoneybond.org. And you can navigate that particular website and find that information. It is 8:26. We are actually a bit over time. I appreciate your patience. Carol, I'm going to let you have the final word.
Okay, thanks, Elisa. This has been a really informative time and a lot of new information. I had a question originally for James, and that was, you mentioned what everybody can do. Do you see a special role for the technologists, for the people who are actually writing this code? Because just to pick up on what Alex said, in fact, the writers of the code, the creators of these are mostly working for large firms like Google and so forth, and are in fact ethical and sentient people. We've seen big movements at Google, for example, for ethical AI, and Google has fired some of the people who are working for ethical AI. But there's ongoing organizing by technology workers. I'm just wondering if you see a special role for those of us who are, you know, going to be employed by these giants, perhaps, or who are going to not be employed by them, what we can do especially. So,
well, I think the organizing that you're mentioning is really important, that these technology workers are coming together and beginning to reflect on the implications of their work. And I think there's something also connected to that, is how are people being educated in universities when they're being educated in technology? What are they being educated about ethics? Are they being educated about social justice? How do we change that education, impact that education, so that people coming out of these training programs and these degree programs are already thinking about the implications of different kinds of technology, and how they, with the knowledge and experience that they have, how they can reshape that technology to be able to address the major problems of the day, the problems of the day, like the climate crisis, like structural racism. How can this technology be used to solve these problems rather than to enhance the disparities?
right. I think that's really important, and in fact, I know our university has begun to have those discussions and to support, and others. I think MIT and NYU also have these kind of be sure to understand that you are an ethical human being as well as a developer of code. So I think that that's part of the way, but I do, thanks.
Was the question also directed at me, Carol?
Yeah, sure.
So as I said, it's the scientific and technological developments are inherently amoral. They don't have a morality. They don't have ethics attached to them. And I think that the people who develop most of these technologies that end up being misused later either have no idea that they can be misused. I'm sure that those botanists had no idea that hotspot mapping was going to end up being used, not on random plant species or a bug that's taking over a state, the invasive species of bug, but rather to completely keep targeting unfairly communities of color. And then there are others who have this kind of willful ignorance about how the technology that they are developing can be misused. So the creator of Clearview AI, when interviewed about if he was concerned at all about all of these potential issues with the technology and the database that he had created, could pose to many different types of people, he basically said, I had never thought of it. And that, in my opinion, is the line between, whoever created the technology, just like, whoever enabled the creation of the technology, just like Albert Einstein enabled the creation of the bomb, yet was a complete anti-war person and was horrified by the results of the bomb. There are also those who are just willfully ignorant from an ethical, historical, and contextual perspective, who are developing and implementing these technological innovations that then end up hurting people. So it is a matter of educating ourselves and educating others. In my opinion, those who end up saying, like the creator of Clearview, I had no idea, have been basically failed by whatever education system they were part of, by not even understanding that there are historical, contextual, social contexts that affect the way in which they deploy the technologies that they have developed.
Elizabeth, we can't exclude you from the conversation, given the fact you are the Center for the Study of Ethics, ding, 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 and the professions, ding, 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 ding.
That's why I thought it would be good to say something. I mean, at Illinois Tech, we do teach, or I do teach courses in ethics of artificial intelligence, ethics of information communications technology, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. There are also other people who teach and who have modules or who mention ethics or talk about ethics. And I think it is important to teach these things and to make students reflect, think about ethical implications, social implications. I think this is really important, but it's not a once during your studies doing this. It should be something that is continuously accompanying people, like that is sort of part of a culture to think about these things, and also to think that these are in the same way important as there are as the technological things. I mean, ethics is sometimes, thinking about the implications is sometimes considered something like, oh yeah, this is nice, but what really matters is, how to code, how to do the technology, how to do the engineering, how to do science, whatever. And I mean, I can see this, that these are the fundamental techniques, capabilities students do have to learn, but thinking about the implications is important. And what we can do, we can motivate them to critically reflect on these things. And in my experience, they are eager to start thinking about this, and then they say, oh, we have never thought about this, or this is interesting or something. But it would be important to kind of continue, make this more sustainable. So kind of have this not just as 1 or 2 courses at university, but kind of have a culture that really stresses these aspects.
Thank you. And I will say thank you to James, thank you to Alex, thank you, Elizabeth, for chiming in, and to Carol. And most of all, thank you to our audience. If you've not had the opportunity to pick up James's book, which is on the middle tier of my bookcase. I encourage you to do so. It is both fascinating and horrifying all at the same time. But it certainly gives you an opportunity to figure out how you can fit in and be an agent of change. Again, thank you all so much. I will provide the recording and have a wonderful evening.